The blood trail led straight to his water well. Tobias Hartwell had seen enough wounded animals in his 37 years on this God-forsaken ranch to know the difference between a deer's blood and something else entirely. But hold on, what he found next will shock you. Stay tuned to Narrative Sphere to find out. When he followed those crimson drops around the corner of his barn, what he found made his hand freeze on his rifle. A young Indian warrior lay crumpled against the stone wall of his well, one hand pressed desperately against a gaping wound in his side, the other reaching weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head. The man's breathing came in sharp, painful gasps, and his dark eyes, though clouded with pain, tracked Tobias's every movement with the alertness of someone who expected death to come from any direction. This was 1847, the kind of year when finding an Indian on your property meant one thing: trouble. The kind of trouble that could get a man scalped in his sleep or burned alive in his own home. Every neighbor within 50 miles would tell Tobias the same thing: put a bullet in the savage's head and bury him deep where no one would ever find the body. Tobias raised his rifle, finger hovering over the trigger. The smart thing, the safe thing, the expected thing. But something in those dark eyes stopped him cold. Want to know what made Tobias hesitate? Keep listening to Narrative Sphere for a twist that'll leave you speechless. It wasn't just pain he saw there. It was the same desperate thirst he'd felt during the drought of 44. When he'd gone 3 days without water and thought he might die from it. The same human need that transcended skin color, language, or which side of a war you were born into. The Indian tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding, but only a whisper came out: "Water." Tobias lowered his rifle and reached for the bucket. His neighbors would call him a fool. His brother back east would say he'd lost his mind to the frontier loneliness. Hell, maybe they'd be right. But as he knelt beside this wounded stranger and pressed the wooden rim to his lips, watching him drink like a man saved from drowning, Tobias knew one thing for certain: he was about to change both their lives forever. What Tobias didn't know was that this wounded warrior wasn't just any member of the local tribes, and what happened next would bring more riders to his ranch than he'd ever seen in his entire life. The Indian drank like a man who hadn't seen water in days. 3 full buckets before his trembling hands could finally hold the rim steady. Tobias watched every gulp, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just done. In this territory, showing mercy to an Indian was like signing your own death warrant. But as the color slowly returned to the warrior's face, Tobias noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wound in the man's side wasn't from an animal attack or a hunting accident. It was a bullet hole, fresh, still bleeding, and judging by the angle and the powder burns around the edges, someone had shot him at close range. Recent close range, which meant whoever had done this might still be looking for him. Might be tracking that same blood trail that led straight to Tobias's ranch, might be riding toward his property right now, with guns loaded and questions Tobias couldn't answer. The Indian seemed to sense his fear. With great effort, he raised one hand and pointed toward the horizon, then made a cutting motion across his throat. His message was clear. Danger was coming soon. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to drag this wounded stranger away from his property. Hide the evidence. Pretend this never happened. But the man could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving him now would probably kill him. And leaving him here was like hanging a target on both their backs. That's when Tobias heard it. The sound that had kept him alive through 12 years of frontier living. Hoofbeats in the distance. Multiple horses, riding hard and fast, coming straight toward his ranch. The Indian heard them too. His eyes went wide with what looked like genuine fear, and he tried to push himself up against the well, as if making himself smaller might somehow make him invisible. Blood immediately began seeping through his fingers, where he pressed them against his wound. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket and doused the blood trail as quickly as he could, but there was no time to clean it all. The riders would be here in minutes, maybe less. He looked down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his life and turned it upside down in the span of a single afternoon. A man whose presence on his ranch could get them both killed, but whose dark eyes held something Tobias had never seen in an Indian before. Gratitude, pure human gratitude. The hoofbeats were getting closer now, close enough to count them. 5 horses, maybe 6, all moving at a gallop that suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit. Tobias made his choice in that split second, knowing it might be the last choice he ever made. He couldn't carry the wounded man, but he could hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn. If they could make it that far. But as he reached down to help the Indian to his feet, the warrior grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and shook his head slowly. Then he did something that made Tobias's skin crawl. He smiled, not the grateful smile of a man being saved, but the knowing smile of someone who understood exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders came over the ridge like a storm cloud bringing lightning. 6 men on horseback, dust billowing behind them, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. Tobias recognized the lead rider immediately, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him into every town, from here to Santa Fe. Webb was the kind of lawman who shot first and asked questions later, especially when it came to Indian troubles, the kind who collected scalps as trophies and called it justice, the kind who would burn down a ranch and everyone in it if he suspected them of harboring fugitives. Tobias stood in front of the well, his body blocking the Indian from view, trying to look like a man who had nothing more pressing on his mind than fixing a broken fence post. His mouth felt dry as desert sand. Webb reined in his horse just 10 feet away, close enough that Tobias could see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 men spread out in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. This wasn't a social call. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who knew he held all the cards. "We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads right to your property." Tobias felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen any Indians, Marshal. Been working on the south fence all day." Webb's eyes swept across the ranch, taking in every detail. The man missed nothing. It's what made him so dangerous. His gaze lingered on the dark stains in the dirt near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach drop. "That's so." Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Because that sure looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently." Behind Tobias, hidden by the stone wall of the well, the wounded Indian remained perfectly still, but Tobias could feel the tension radiating from him, like heat from a forge. One sound, one movement, and they were both dead men. Webb took 3 steps closer, his hand now resting openly on his pistol. "You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's the same penalty as for treason. A rope around the neck until dead." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring, ready to fight or run, knowing neither option would save them. Webb was too close now. Any sudden movement would expose the Indian, and once that happened, bullets would start flying. That's when something impossible happened. The wounded Indian spoke, not in English, but in his native tongue. A string of words that flowed like music, clear and strong despite his injuries. Words that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-step, and the color drained from his face like water from a broken bucket. Webb's hand fell away from his pistol. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And when he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dear God, you're him." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten, their faces showing the same mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear. But not the kind of fear men show when facing an enemy. The kind of fear men show when they realize they've just made a terrible, terrible mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now pale as winter snow. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's terrified face, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud. In 12 years of frontier living, he'd never seen the ruthless lawmen show fear of anything. Not outlaws, not wild animals, not even the Apache war parties that had burned 3 settlements to ash just last summer. But now, Webb looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. The wounded Indian spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire ranch. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's. "This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The peace treaty, the same treaty that had stopped 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache. The same treaty that had saved hundreds of lives on both sides. The same treaty that had made it safe for families to settle in this territory without fear of midnight raids. And he'd been watering the man who made it all possible. But if Ayanna was a peacemaker, why was he running from the law with a bullet in his side? "There was an ambush," Ayanna continued, his breathing still labored, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to grey. "Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder because that's what they want you to believe," Ayanna said, pushing himself up straighter against the well. "Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet." The implications hit Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had staged Morrison's murder to frame Ayanna. Someone who wanted the peace treaty destroyed. Someone who wanted the territory to burn. Again, who? Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayanna's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The same men who've been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who've been making a fortune off this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers." Webb took a step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon, before stopping. "You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations, and they'll remain accusations until I can prove them," Ayanna replied. "Which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started." Tobias watched this exchange with growing dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayanna was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest a fugitive. He'd come here to commit murder. The silence stretched like a taut rope about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, eyes darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache who just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the war happening. Behind Webb's eyes, the marshal was trapped between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayana replied, his voice steady, despite the pain etched across his face. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty. Shut up, Bradley, Webb snapped. But Tobias could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression, like cracks in a dam wall. That's when Ayana played his final card. Reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with trembling fingers, he pulled out a folded piece of paper stained with blood. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter like it might burst into flames. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts, enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Ayana's eyes never left Webb's face, including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He was witnessing something that could get them all killed. The moment when a corrupt lawman realized his own neck was on the chopping block. You're lying, Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Ayana held up the letter. Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. Told me to get it to Fort Richardson if anything happened to him. Said it was insurance. Webb took a step forward, his hand now gripping his pistol. Give me that letter so you can destroy it. Ayana shook his head. I don't think so, Marshal. But I'll make you a deal. Let me live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll make sure your name isn't mentioned when this all comes to light. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Tobias could see Webb calculating odds, weighing risks, trying to figure out which choice would keep him alive longer. But what happened next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and walked slowly toward the well, his hands raised peacefully. Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that shipment of rifles that went missing 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by Indians. Webb's face darkened. What about it? I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later in the hands of settlers heading south. Bradley's young face was flushed with either courage or fear. Made me wonder who was really stealing from whom. The admission cracked something open in the group. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, sharing glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. And Tobias realized that Ayana had just done something remarkable. Without firing a shot or raising his voice, he turned Webb's own men against him. If you're enjoying this story of courage in the Old West, hit that subscribe button to Narrative Sphere, because what happens next will change everything these men thought they knew about justice. But Webb wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight, and when cornered, dangerous men did dangerous things. Webb's hand tightened on his pistol grip, until his knuckles went white. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous, and Tobias could see the exact moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. "You're all fools," Webb snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping away. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead Indian and a handful of traitors?" The deputies spread out instinctively, hands moving toward their weapons. But Tobias could see the uncertainty in their faces. Years of following orders warred against the growing realization that those orders might be wrong. Ayana struggled to his feet, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped through his fingers, where he pressed them against his wound, but his voice remained steady. "The truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It just is. The truth," Webb spat, "is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to collect the bounty on your head." He drew his pistol in one smooth motion, the barrel swinging toward Ayana. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon raised. "Stand down, Marshal!" The words cracked like thunder across the ranch. 4 other deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who looked as corrupt as his boss. "You're making a mistake, boys," Webb said, though sweat now beaded on his forehead. "A mistake that'll cost you your badges. Maybe your lives." "Maybe," Bradley replied. "But I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I won't make any more." Tobias watched this standoff with growing dread. 6 armed men in his yard, all pointing guns at each other, all convinced they were in the right. This was how range wars started. This was how good men died for bad reasons. That's when Ayana did something unexpected. He began to sing, not in English, but in Apache, a low haunting melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the ranch like wind through canyon walls, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stood together against the darkness. The effect was immediate and startling. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not understanding the words, but feeling their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily mesmerized by the sound. And while they listened, transfixed, Ayana was doing something else entirely. He was calling to his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind, to ears that knew how to listen. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. Ayana wasn't just singing. He was summoning. The melody ended, and silence fell over the ranch like a heavy blanket. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, distant, but growing closer. Many hoofbeats, moving fast. Webb heard them too. His face went pale as moonlight. How many? Ayana smiled despite his pain. Enough. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes. Webb raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at Tobias's chest. "You did this. You helped him signal them." "I gave a dying man water," Tobias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Same as I'd do for any creature suffering on my land." The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel in the ground beneath their feet, close enough to count, too many to count. And Webb finally understood what Ayana had been planning all along. They came over the horizon like a vision from another world. 50 Apache warriors on horseback, moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about Indian war parties. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief, whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away. His grey hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignities of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned fighters to young braves, barely old enough to carry weapons, but their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his pistol trained on Tobias, but his hand shook like a man with fever. "This changes nothing. I still have my orders. Your orders," came a new voice, "are no longer valid." Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley, holding up an official-looking document. "This came through this morning, Marshal, direct from the Territorial Governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face went purple with rage. "You lying piece of—" "Check your own dispatch pouch," Bradley interrupted. "Unless you've been too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail." The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well, where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayanna's face, searching for signs of serious injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred, the reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound, his face grave with concern. Ayanna responded in the same language, but Tobias caught enough English mixed in to understand the gist, the truth, the conspiracy, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's pistol wavered. "I came here to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's remaining ally, Hawkins, was slowly backing his horse away from the circle, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You have no proof," Webb said, but his voice cracked on the words. The chief smiled, not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the real killers who confessed everything before they died trying to escape our justice. And we have something else." He gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you knew." Webb's world collapsed in that moment. Tobias watched a corrupt man realize that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses reliable, the justice inevitable. But cornered animals were unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding common sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought. Ayanna threw himself between the gun and his father, despite his wound. The pistol fired, and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison. But the shot went wild because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and rage. The dust settled like a curtain falling on the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol thrown clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But it was what happened next that would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life. The chief walked slowly to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. The old man's weathered face showed no expression as he studied this white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache, words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Ayana translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "You are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear. These are the actions of a true warrior." Tobias felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening to let in light he'd never seen before. All his life, he'd been taught that Indians were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a circle around him. One by one, they approached and touched his hand. Not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color or culture. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away, a war lance, decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained, "and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache, until today, as the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Apache prepared to depart. Ayana's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man, and though he was still weak, he would live to see the peace treaty expanded and the real conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Ayana clasped Tobias's hand one final time. "You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples." "I just gave a thirsty man some water," Tobias replied. Sometimes Ayana smiled. That's how the world changes, one cup of water at a time. 24 hours later, exactly as the title had promised, they were gone. But they left behind something precious. Proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty was not only renewed, but expanded to include all the tribes of the territory. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation, because sometimes, in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful: the courage to see enemies as human beings, and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear. Want to hear another incredible story from the Old West? Subscribe to Narrative Sphere and click the video on your screen for a tale with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon.